I didn't expect the camping trip to matter as much as it did. At the time, it felt like an easy escape, 2 nights away from the noise of our routines, just trees, a lake, and the quiet comfort of someone I'd known for years. Lucas had suggested it casually, the way he did most things, as if he hadn't been holding onto the idea for a while. I said yes without thinking, because saying yes to Lucas had always come naturally to me. We'd been friends since college, close enough to finish each other's sentences but distant enough to pretend we didn't notice the changes in each other. Lucas was different now. He laughed less freely, checked his phone more often, and carried a restlessness that didn't quite fit the calm image he tried to project. Mark, his boyfriend of 3 years, was the invisible third presence between us, never mentioned directly, yet always there, hovering in the pauses of Lucas's sentences. The drive to the campsite was quiet in a comfortable way. Pine trees blurred past the windows, and the radio played low, more habit than entertainment. Lucas kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other drumming against his thigh. When I asked how things were going back home, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Fine," he said, "just busy." I didn't push. I rarely did. By the time we reached the campsite, the sky was already shifting into late afternoon gold. We worked together without much talk, setting up the fire pit, unpacking supplies, laying out the tents. It felt familiar, almost nostalgic, like stepping back into an earlier version of ourselves where complications hadn't yet taken root. Lucas's tent was older than mine, a faded green with stubborn zippers and thin seams. He laughed it off when one of the poles bent slightly, brushing it aside as nothing serious. I noticed the tear later, a thin rip near the side seam that widened when the wind picked up. Lucas crouched beside it, fingers tracing the damage, his jaw tightening. "It'll hold," he said, though it sounded more like a hope than a fact. We ate dinner as the light faded, sitting across from each other by the fire. The flames reflected in Lucas's eyes, making them look darker, more intense. He talked about work, about plans he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. I listened, filling the spaces with nods and small responses, aware of how closely I was watching him. When night settled fully around us, the temperature dropped faster than expected. The wind returned, sharper this time, pushing against the tents with impatient hands. I was halfway asleep when I heard fabric tearing, followed by Lucas's muffled curse. I crawled out of my tent to find him standing there, flashlight in hand, the rip now unmistakable and wide enough to let the cold pour in. "It's done," he said quietly, almost embarrassed. I didn't think it was that bad. We stood there for a moment, the forest pressing in on us, the practical solution obvious but unspoken. 2 tents had become one, and neither of us seemed eager to acknowledge what that meant. "You can use mine," I said finally. "It's big enough." Lucas hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the ruined tent and then back to me. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "It's just for the night." That was the lie we both accepted. Inside my tent, the air felt different, warmer, closer. We arranged our sleeping bags with deliberate care, leaving a narrow gap between us that felt symbolic rather than necessary. Lucas lay on his back, staring up at the tent ceiling as if it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. "Thanks," he said softly. "For this, for coming." I wanted to say more, to ask the questions I'd been avoiding all day, but the words stayed lodged in my chest. Outside, the wind settled, and the forest grew still. Inside, with Lucas breathing just inches away, I realized this trip was already becoming something else entirely, and we hadn't even reached the part where choices were made. Sleep didn't come easily. The tent seemed smaller with Lucas inside it, the thin fabric catching every shift of air, every sound of the forest. I lay on my side, facing away from him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the occasional rustle as he adjusted his sleeping bag. The narrow space between us felt charged, like a question neither of us wanted to ask out loud. After a while, Lucas spoke. "Are you awake?" "Yeah," I answered, too quickly. He turned onto his side, facing me. I didn't need to look to know it, I could feel the change in the air, the way attention sharpens even in the dark. "Sorry if this is weird," he said. "I didn't plan on ruining the trip." "You didn't," I replied. "Things happen." He was quiet again, and I thought that might be the end of it. But Lucas had always struggled with silence when it carried too much weight. "Mark hates camping," he said suddenly. "Says it's uncomfortable. Pointless." I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "Sounds like Mark." There it was, his name, finally spoken. It landed between us with a soft thud, heavier than it should have been. Lucas exhaled slowly. He wanted to come anyway. I told him I needed space. For what? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Lucas didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower, more careful. To remember what quiet feels like. To remember myself. I shifted onto my back, staring at the dark ceiling inches above me. Lucas had always been thoughtful, but this sounded different, raw in a way I wasn't used to hearing from him. You seem tired, I said. I am, he admitted. Not physically, just, like I'm always performing. Being the version of myself that fits. I turned my head then, finally meeting his gaze. His face was half-shadowed, but I could see the tension in his brow, the vulnerability he usually kept hidden behind humor. You don't have to perform here, I said. Lucas studied me for a moment, as if deciding whether to believe that. That's why I asked you to come, he said quietly. You've always seen me without needing anything from me. The words settled deep, warming and unsettling all at once. I wanted to tell him that wasn't entirely true, that wanting nothing from him was a skill I'd never mastered. Instead, I nodded, letting the moment pass without confession. The night stretched on. Outside, the forest hummed with distant life, branches creaking, leaves whispering. Inside, our conversation drifted in fragments. We talked about college memories, about the jobs we'd fallen into instead of choosing. Lucas laughed softly once or twice, and each time it felt like a small victory. At some point, his phone vibrated. The screen lit up the tent briefly before he silenced it, turning it face down without looking. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. Do you ever wonder, Lucas said, what it would have been like if we'd made different choices? The question hung there, dangerous in its simplicity. All the time, I said, because it was the truth, even if I hadn't planned on sharing it. He shifted closer, not touching me, just enough that the gap between us narrowed. I became acutely aware of every inch of space, of how deliberate the distance now felt. I don't regret my life, he continued. I just regret how little room there is in it. I swallowed. Room for what? For honesty, he said. For wanting things that don't fit neatly. Quote, we lay there, facing each other, the weight of unsaid words pressing in. I could sense Lucas holding back, measuring himself, and I recognized the same restraint in my own chest. This was the edge, where friendship strained against something more complicated, something that asked for courage neither of us had yet claimed. Eventually, Lucas rolled onto his back, breaking the moment. We should sleep, he said, almost apologetically. Yeah, I agreed, though sleep still felt far away. As the tent fell quiet again, I realized how thin the line was between comfort and longing, between being there for someone and stepping somewhere you couldn't return from. The night wasn't over, and neither was whatever had begun to take shape between us. I woke to the sound of rain tapping insistently against the tent, the kind of steady rhythm that blurs time and thought. The darkness had thinned into a muted gray, suggesting early morning without fully committing to it. The air inside the tent was warmer now, heavy with shared breath and the closeness we'd avoided naming. Lucas was awake. I knew it before I opened my eyes. There's a certain awareness that comes when someone is thinking too loudly beside you. When I turned my head, he was already looking at me, his expression caught somewhere between relief and unease. Did I wake you? He asked. No, I said. I was already up. That wasn't entirely true, but it felt easier than explaining the restless half-sleep I'd been trapped in, full of thoughts I didn't want to claim as my own. The rain intensified, drumming against the fabric until it felt like the world outside had narrowed to this small, fragile shelter. Lucas pushed himself up on one elbow. It's coming down hard, he said, glancing toward the tent wall as if he could see through it. Looks like we're stuck here for a bit. Could be worse, I replied, though my voice lacked conviction. He smiled faintly, then grew serious again just as quickly. About last night, he began, then stopped. His hand tightened around the edge of his sleeping bag. I talked too much. I shook my head. You said what you needed to say. That's the problem, Lucas said. I don't usually let myself do that. There was an honesty in his admission that stripped away the last of my defenses. I shifted closer without fully realizing it, the movement small but unmistakable. Lucas noticed. His breath hitched, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I keep thinking about Mark, he said, almost to himself. About how I should feel more certain than I do. Certainty isn't automatic, I said. It takes work, and choice. Lucas met my eyes again. And what if you choose wrong? The question landed heavily. I thought of all the moments in life defined by a single step taken, or not taken. Then you live with it, I said. You learn. The rain softened, as if the forest itself was listening. Lucas leaned back slightly, then hesitated, his shoulder brushing mine. The contact was brief, accidental in appearance only. Neither of us moved away. I don't want to hurt anyone, he said quietly. Neither do I answered, and meant more than he knew. The silence stretched, thick and expectant. Lucas's hand shifted, resting between us, close enough that I could feel its warmth without touching it. My heart pounded, loud enough that I wondered if he could hear it. This feels dangerous, he murmured. Then we should stop, I said. He didn't move. Neither did I. The moment broke not with urgency, but with gentleness. Lucas's fingers brushed mine, light, tentative, as if testing whether the world would collapse at the contact. It didn't. Instead, something else gave way, the careful balance we'd maintained, the unspoken rules we'd relied on to keep things simple. We pulled back almost immediately, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. Lucas stood abruptly, turning his back as he reached for his jacket. I need air, he said, his voice strained. He ducked out into the rain, leaving me alone with the echo of his presence and the realization that a line had been crossed, not dramatically, not irreversibly, but enough to change everything that came after. I sat there, staring at the spot where his hand had been, understanding too late that some moments don't announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly, disguised as almost nothing, and leave behind a silence that can never quite be filled. By the time Lucas returned, the rain had softened into a fine mist, more suggestion than sound. He moved quietly, as if afraid to disturb something fragile, and sat on the edge of the tent without looking at me. His hair was damp, his shoulders tense beneath his jacket. I could tell he'd been rehearsing words he wasn't sure he should say. I shouldn't have done that, he said at last. I nodded, because disagreement would have been dishonest. I know. The simplicity of the exchange surprised me. There was no anger in it, no drama, just an acknowledgement of something that had already settled into the past. Lucas exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his posture as if naming the mistake had loosened its grip. I keep thinking about how easy it felt, he continued. And how that scares me. It scared me too, I admitted. Morning light filtered through the tent walls, pale and revealing. It stripped the night of its ambiguity, leaving us with clarity we hadn't asked for. In daylight, everything seemed sharper, the closeness we'd shared, the restraint we'd barely managed, the reality waiting beyond this campsite. Lucas's phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't silence it immediately. He stared at the screen, jaw set, then turned it off entirely. Mark's probably worried, he said. Or angry. Or both, I offered gently. He managed a small, humorless smile. Yeah. We packed up in near silence, our movements careful, deliberate. The ruined tent lay folded to the side, a quiet reminder of how easily plans fall apart. As we worked, I noticed how Lucas avoided eye contact, not out of discomfort, but out of something closer to resolve. When everything was loaded into the car, Lucas leaned against the door and looked out over the trees one last time. I need to go home and be honest, he said. About everything, even the parts that make me look bad. I respected him for that, even as a part of me mourned what that honesty would cost. That's the right thing, I said. He turned to me then, really looking at me, as if trying to memorize my face. I'm sorry if I pulled you into something you didn't ask for. I chose to be here, I replied. With you. That's on me too. The drive back was quieter than the trip out. Not awkward, just reflective. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, his focus steady, as if anchoring himself to something solid. I watched the landscape pass by, feeling the weight of a connection that had revealed itself only to recede again. When we reached my place, Lucas parked but didn't turn off the engine right away. I don't know what happens next, he said. But I know it can't be this. I understood what he meant. Some moments are meant to exist only once, not as beginnings, but as clarifications. Whatever happens, I said, I'm glad we didn't pretend it was nothing. He nodded, gratitude softening his expression. Me too. We hugged briefly before he left, an embrace stripped of confusion, grounded in respect. As his car disappeared down the street, I stood there longer than necessary, letting the quiet settle around me. Later, Alone, I thought about how close we'd come to changing everything, and how restraint, too, is a kind of choice. The trip hadn't given me what I might have wanted, but it had given me something else, the understanding that desire doesn't always demand fulfillment, and that some connections are defined not by what happens, but by what almost does. And in that almost, I found a truth I wouldn't forget.